Hello, everyone. This is Zicheng Wang of the Technology Newsletter. I'm a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, a leading non-governmental think tank in Beijing. But as many of you know, I'm currently on leave to attend Princeton University in the United States. And I'm sorry, this podcast didn't happen for like 2 weeks, I guess, because like Robert and I were a little bit busy during the time. So as in the two other episodes before this, I'm talking to Robert Wu, who is the CEO of Baiguan or Baiguan Lab. It's a
Yes.
data analytics company with a lot of multinational clients. They provide valuable alternative data to market participants, financial institutions, and everyone else. And so, did I miss any
No,
part of your job, Robert? And you
ho-
also write the newsletters by yourself and on behalf of the company, huh?
yes, we have two newsletters. One is the company one called Baiguan, and another one is my personal one, China Translated. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, so what we do is this is totally, there is no script. So we just two friends talking with each other, going through the news that just happened. So, Robert, you are leading a private company in China. And I think in terms of China news, one of the bigger things that happened this week is that the Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted a meeting with, like, I think a big number of China's leading entrepreneurs, Jack Ma of Alibaba, Pony Ma of Tencent, of DeepSeek, they all showed up. And I think there
Yes.
were 4 or 5 or 6 private entrepreneurs reportedly, giving their voices at the meeting, which received a lot of press. So what do you think?
Yeah, well, to be sure, this is not the first symposium or gathering with private businessmen and entrepreneurs in China between them and the top leadership. It's not even the first during the Xi's leadership. But I think in terms of the scale, this one is a bit unprecedented because you see all the heavyweights in the private sector. Most of the largest companies, both in terms of market cap and in terms of revenues, are there, right?
Yeah.
Sitting directly in front of Xi is Ren Zhengfei of Huawei and also Wang Chuanfu of BYD, really the leaders of the high-end manufacturing in China, and really the faces of the so-called new quality productive forces, basically. But in the same time, it's not just manufacturing, but all the top internet companies. I mean, maybe not all, but most, right? You have Tencent, you have Alibaba, you have Xiaomi, which is
Meituan, right?
Meituan
Yeah.
as well, yes. And then you also have some more traditional manufacturing or consumer companies that have longer history. So it's a great mix of, and also the startups, right? The DeepSeek and the Unitree, the robotics company. And the DeepSeek one is really remarkable. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that DeepSeek is breaking a record for basically meeting with the China's top leadership in the shortest, I mean, twice, right? In a shortest period of time. Because
Oh,
in,
you're referring to CEO Liang Wenfeng's, like, he attended another meeting with Li Qiang, China's
yeah,
premier, which is like the second highest ranking official a few weeks ago, I guess.
yes,
That's
it's
before the
January.
R3 modem, shocked the entire world. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's on the same day. No, R1 model. So it's the same day that they make the news about their meeting with Premier Li, but also almost the same day they published the R1 paper, which a few days later shocked the whole world. And that was like late January. I counted. It's actually within less than a month. Liang Wenfeng appeared there again, this time facing not only Premier Li, but also for sure President Xi. I think he did break a record for that, if there is a
Okay.
record. Yeah, yeah. And also for sure everyone is paying attention to Jack Ma. Interestingly, if you go out there and ask any Westerners or, anyone outside of China, name one Chinese entrepreneur, I think most of the time people would just think about the name and the face of Jack Ma, right?
Yes.
The kind of mind shares that Jack Ma occupied in outside world's understanding of China's private economy is just so huge. Maybe 95% of mind share, I guess. So, but we all know that there is some controversy for the last few years, starting from his speech in Shanghai in late 2020, and then a few days later, the cancellation of the Ant Financial IPO. And basically for the next few years, he was rarely seen publicly. I think many people thought that he was in prison or something, but he was never.
Come on, yes.
Yeah.
I've heard, stories like this. Let's say he was not in, was like at how to put it, like apparently, because of the series of events, so he's not on the huge favor side of the Chinese government during those periods of time. But that's a far cry from, him like being detained or disappeared. That's definitely not true. I mean, actually, if you pay attention to Chinese like internet-based media outlets, every few months he would appear in the campus of the companies. I mean, Ant Financial now, I think known as Ant Group, and also Alibaba, and he was seen in Japan and quite a few different
golfing, yachting. There was not even a penalty. There was not even, his shares, his wealth is all there. I
think he kept a lower profile, basically. And maybe he thought it would be politically better for the companies he once led. I mean, he doesn't run the company on a daily basis anymore, and so I mean, his appearance at the meeting is some sort of confirmation that especially with all these other technology companies in China, there was this widely portrayed crackdown on Chinese tech companies, but most of them were there at the meeting. So I think that sends a strong signal, basically, to Robert mentioned a word which probably was not very familiar for listeners who do not follow China on a daily basis. The new quality productive forces, that's a buzzword in Beijing. Basically, there is no very clear definition of what it actually means, but basically, leveraging all sorts of new technology to accelerate the transition to higher value, manufacturing and other industries, including services. So their appearance there, I think, is like, I mean, for these companies, of course, it was pretty good news. And I mean, for Alibaba itself, there is quite some like upstick in its share prices, right?
Yeah, but it's a mixture of many things. We'll come back to that later, but I think there's something more I want to comment on this symposium. I think, there's a risk or danger of people reading too much into this kind of gathering. I don't see it as significant as many people thought. So private economy, they have their own pace of development, right? It's not about state coming out and be there and give their, very driven push to the private economy. It's really about recognizing the efforts and the contribution made by the private economy and a kind of encouragement for the private economy to contribute more to, national goals. But then all these private economies, these companies, they are successful not because of the state, right? They have their own ecosystems. Like if you take DeepSeek as an example, last time we talked about, the fact that DeepSeek was totally under the radar, not seen by the state until they made it. They made it to, national or international fame, right? So
yes.
What I mean is, I think it will be dangerous to assume that all these companies are relying on state support or will. The fact is, I think the significance and usefulness of this kind of symposium is really in the other direction, which is, for the last few years, there are many concerns about, we talk about this thing called the high sea fishing or deep sea fishing, right? You have these kind of profit driven or rent seeking law enforcement on private businesses outside of
from
local governments.
one province in China. China is a huge country, so
Yeah.
Law enforcement at one place would go to like travel 1,000 kilometers or miles to basically conduct law enforcement on another private company, out of the intention that they can shake some money off the company, which is termed as, yuan yang bu lao, high seas fishing, as if, these private companies are fish in the water. So, I think I agree with you that basically, Beijing has like repeatedly warned such local law enforcement will not be tolerated, and that, the meeting with the private companies would serve to reinforce that signal. And what you just mentioned, I think actually touched on something many people talk about, and I think I had a conversation with someone in a WeChat group, which is basically what kind of state support that these successful Chinese private companies actually got. I mean, you just mentioned DeepSeek, and we talked about it, I think, in our last podcast. It's basically, this is a startup. This is like they are the spin-off of or an in-house arm of a quant fund in China, and the quant fund has not been supported by the Chinese government in any way. Actually, like both the individual stock market investors and the Chinese media and the Chinese government were, especially the securities regulator, were quite harsh with the quant investors, because like they believe they do not contribute to the stock market, and they were just using some high-tech advantage to take advantage of other investors. So, and I think it was like similar story at the beginning with even Huawei and Alibaba and these Chinese companies as well. Actually, if you look at the old history of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, the founder, who was actually, let's be honest, who was like laid off from the Chinese military, because at that time Chinese military was like cutting down 1 million soldiers. So he was laid off. He did not have a job. So he started this company, and initially he didn't have a lot of success. He was defrauded, and the company was in big trouble. And even when Huawei began to take off, I think until like 2017 or 2016, like the majority of its revenue came from outside the Chinese mainland. And there were a lot of reports back in the 2000s that it was always Nokia and Ericsson, which have been winning the contracts, basically beating Huawei when it comes to the procurement by Chinese state-run mobile operators. So there are a lot of descriptions of the so-called Chinese state capitalism theory, and I mean there are a lot of things to debate, but at least I'm sure in the early period, at their founding, all these private companies, they made it to a certain level all by themselves. And that's basically entrepreneurship and, free enterprise thriving in a admittedly curtailed market economy. But nevertheless, it's like private entrepreneurship, the hard work of their employees, the innovation, and
Yes. I think the most memorable quotes I saw from someone on the DeepSeek thing is, because DeepSeek was founded in Hangzhou, and that someone was basically responding to people whether Hangzhou government was supporting DeepSeek. And I really love the line. He basically said, it's not that Hangzhou government provide any support. They didn't, but they really, made a good choice of not cracking down on the high flyer the quant fund that is behind. And that's the best thing that the government did to make this possible, right? So that's true. If they were harsher and they cracked down on quant harsher when a year ago there was this quant related market crash in China, that you might not have DeepSeek now. So I think it's just still the government is figuring out what's the boundaries between public and private, leaving a good environment for new ideas and innovation to grow. It's not really a one-sided thing. And I think this symposium really a symbol of the two sides kind of coming together, recognizing each other, but also I think they are recognizing each party have a role to play in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. So I think generally it's positive, but just don't read too much into it, I think.
Yeah. And there were some entrepreneurs who were not present at the meeting. Like I think Richard Changdong Liu of JD.com, which is one of the largest e-commerce companies in China, like the Chinese Amazon, and also Robin Li Yanhong, the head of Baidu, the dominant search engine in China. I don't know if it's still dominant these days.
Not at all.
They were not present. Because, the rise of all these AI tools will probably, challenge the market share of search engines because people just use these tools to do online searches. And so they were not there. But generally speaking, I think Hong Kong stock market has been doing quite good, and the Chinese technology stocks listed in the United States, they've been doing pretty good, right?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. So first of all, is the DeepSeek moment. It's basically changing the narrative for China tech space, but as well as the whole technology and, market. So a lot of these money in the US, which has been chasing NASDAQ and all these AI names like NVIDIA for so many years, they suddenly realized that China is back on the table. So that started in late January and early February. But then there are many, just basically a number of good news. One specific one for the last week was the quarterly results of Alibaba. It was a pretty good results compared with the last many quarters and years for Alibaba. So you see at the same time, not only the e-commerce revenue grows back to growth, basically, but then you also have, very crucially, the cloud computing business is also changing gears. The Ali Cloud business has been growing quite slowly, single digit growth even for some quarters now. But this last quarter, growth accelerates to double-digit growth, driven by AI demand. And more surprisingly, Alibaba is ramping up, exponentially the capital expenditures, mostly for all, AI-related inference servers and all these investments, which is confirming really this DeepSeek moment is having some really big real-world impact. So, last Friday was pretty crazy for the market, both in Hong Kong, in China ADRs, as well as the tech sector in the A shares, especially related to data centers, right? Because, everyone is looking at, Alibaba is going to spend so much money on these data centers. And so will be other players like Tencent, ByteDance, Huawei. It's basically, US Magnificent Seven back in 2023, when all these Microsoft or Apple, Meta people, they are upping their game in terms of capital expenditures or CapEx. So that's really giving another boost in the market. So while at the same time, NASDAQ and many stocks in the US are kind of falling a little bit. It's really if you look at the market for the last 2 weeks, you have this sense, you have this feeling that it's really about the so-called, the East is rising and West is falling, at least for the last few weeks. So,
well, I think, as a background, I'm sure we all know S&P 500 and NASDAQ and all these Magnificent Seven, they've been rising for quite some time. And people doubt, there must be some ceiling for all these stocks. You can't have unlimited rise. And on the other hand, in the Chinese market, the stocks have been doing terribly. The return to, especially in the Chinese mainland investors on the A share stock market has been terrible. And basically they have, the question is, have they reached the bottom? It's time for a evaluation of their stocks.
Yeah, I think that one is pretty much concluded. But the thing is, this time the rally is still very specific to the market and specific to the sector. So it's specific to the offshore part of China market, right? Be it Hong Kong or US ADRs, and also specific to sector. So it's now mostly just technology. and especially the one that's related to AI, to data centers. But if you look at a broader onshore market, apart from few technology names, most of the onshore A-share market has been maybe basically not moving up that much, not going anywhere. And I think that's, that's why it was very different from, a few months ago when there was this big rally as well, but really short rally. That time it was started from the domestic A-share market on the back of strong policy expectations, right? This time it basically has nothing to do with policy, just about, a technology breakthrough moment. So there's not much participation in terms of the broader sector. For, rest of the market, apart from the technology, they are still pretty uncertain. We are still yet to see substantial improvement in the broader economy. There are stabilization for sure. I don't think it's going to get any worse, but still there are also no meaningful signs of significant improvement. So most of the market are still pretty hesitant. And I think we'll wait for more data and more stimulus and more consumption.
I think there is a lot of uncertainties in terms of policy. I mean, especially given the new administration in the United States and, whether President Donald Trump on now his second term, will he push for a, trade wars 2.0, or maybe as widely reported, he's interested in some sort of big, beautiful deal with the Chinese. But I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, the White House released not a executive order, but a national security presidential memorandum, basically aimed at, promoting foreign investment in the U.S., but also addressing what they call threats posed by foreign adversaries like the People's Republic of China. And I think you have read the memorandum, Robert?
Yes. So I think it touched on a very niche topic of Chinese investment in the U.S. And to be honest, there's actually not much now. It used to be maybe a decade ago, there are quite a lot. Many Chinese companies are also increasing their investment in the U.S. But I think since the first Trump administration, there are just not many Chinese money going to U.S. Maybe apart from some retail or secondary market investment in the U.S. stock markets. But still, there is this thing called a tax treaty between China and the U.S. and was signed in the 80s, which gives some preferential treatment to Chinese investors in the U.S. So, for example, Chinese investors in the U.S., when they get dividends, they don't have to pay, as some other foreigners, they don't have to pay 30% of the tax. They only have to pay 10% of the tax. So for a long time, there was actually, during the Reagan years, I think, there was a tax treaty giving preferential treatment of, Chinese investors in the U.S. And basically, I think the only concrete thing I found from this memorandum is suggesting that this will end, which I think it makes sense, right? Why would U.S. give so much preferences to the Chinese investors now? But then there was also these languages about kind of suggesting further restrictions on the U.S. investors into China assets, and especially on the U.S. listed Chinese assets, Chinese companies, Chinese stocks. This could be more worrying because, many of the Chinese companies are still listed in the U.S., like Alibaba and all these. And right now, the U.S. investors can still invest in them. But if one day suddenly the U.S. government doesn't allow U.S. investors to invest for whatever reasons, then it could be a big loss, for at least a temporary big loss for many of these companies. But I think at least from this memo, I only see the kind of smoke for that language, not really substantive things. There doesn't seem to be a very resolved decision to barring U.S. investors to invest in Chinese stocks. There are just some, problems maybe with accounting standards and all that, but very technical. So just from this, I don't see a direct risk to China US listed Chinese companies for now. So could be a non-issue
I
for
don't
now.
know. I mean, there's this possibility that, this could be one of the negotiating tactics out of the
Yeah, it
White
could be.
House. I mean, that's what, let's say, Canadians and the Mexicans say when President Trump announced that he would levy 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican exports to the U.S. So, and because I think there was this report in the New York Times by Anna Swanson a few days ago, like quoting multiple sources saying President Trump wanted to have like a big deal with his Chinese counterpart. And I'm in Washington, D.C. at this moment. And, I had the privilege of talking to some of the, let's say, very good scholars in terms of China policy making in the U.S., some of them former government officials. And they sort of referred to the report in the New York Times saying like they felt like President Trump he's interested in creating jobs in the United States, to have more, tax revenue within the United States. And he doesn't seem to be very concerned with who are coming to make these investments. So what the impression I got from media reports and also private conversations is that there may be an appetite for him to like have Chinese investment in manufacturing, in, creating good paying jobs in the US. So that could be, if the two sides reach any sort of like deal, that could be one of the items. But this memorandum seems to be like on the different direction from that. So maybe mixed signals, or it's negotiating tactic, or maybe, I'm sure President Trump has a lot of things on his mind and he changes his mind rather quickly. So, so maybe he has a different view, but I guess we will have to wait and see, huh?
Sure. So great. I think that's great for this week. So I think we'll try to keep up the schedule every week, maybe 20 or 30 minutes just to chat about the most important issues about China for the last week. How about that?
Well, I think like we got to address some of the Ukraine issue, right? Like this has been like a dramatic change from the foreign policy of the United States, and it's really surprising. And I've been talking to people because I'm having the vantage point of being physically in the U.S. and the people I talk to are really very surprised. And this and what China would do in terms of Russia, Ukraine, given the unilateral negotiation between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia, and there are a lot of speculations. Maybe you have something to share based on your understanding from the Chinese side, and what the Chinese leaders have been saying publicly, and the Chinese analysis and the Chinese media reporting.
Well, to be honest, I'm not a geopolitics expert, but just from what I feel, there's a lot of these noise in the US and Europe and all that, but I think, well, maybe my feeling's wrong, but I think the China side is pretty silent on the whole issue, right? Is that true from what you feel?
Yes, I think Beijing has appointed a special envoy for the matter, and the special envoy traveled to countries of that region, I think quite a few times, trying to broke a deal, or maybe I think a more accurate language is to find a viable path, for the two sides to work it out in the long term. And I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry's response to the latest developments was that as long as it's good for peace, as long as it's good for, putting out the fire of the battleground, China is open to that. And I'm not sure, how Beijing is evaluating these changes, which happens really, really fast. And it seems like the current U.S. administration is trying to actively undermine the position of President Zelensky in Ukraine, which is just unimaginable,
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's going to last for a while. If the U.S. is really forcing Ukraine to sign over some of its minerals, and this is, I think, This is actually a very interesting detail, is that there is no significant rare earth minerals in Ukraine. There are some minerals, but they are not rare earth. But there is simply not much rare earth minerals. I think a lot of people were misled, but by some initial, commentary or information somewhere. It's just changing so rapidly, and people are struggling to adapt to it. And
I think it's in this kind of chaos, it's better for China just to stay away, just watch how this unfolds. We shouldn't get ourselves too much into these.
Okay, I hope the Chinese Foreign Ministry are listening to this podcast and they will take your advice into active consideration. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so that's all for today. And thanks, Robert. And check out his blog, check out his newsletter on Substack. It's called Baiguan, and the other one, his personal one, is called China Translated. And so happy to talk to you, Robert.
Technology. Yes.
Yes. And so have a nice week ahead, folks. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.